Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 6th of September 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. And joining me today via Skype is Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the programme, Vanessa. Very pleased to have you on.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be back.
So since the last time you appeared on UK Column News, you have spent quite some time in Syria. But just let's begin with this article that I mentioned a couple of days ago from The Telegraph, because I just wanted to highlight this once again, this absolutely cynical propaganda, as I'm calling it. British peers and priests accused of chatting with mass murderer after meeting Assad in Syria. Now, I believe you met this group as you were leaving Syria a few days ago.
Absolutely. I met with them just as they were arriving in Lebanon and about to leave for Syria the following morning. A fascinating group of people, including members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and interfaith reconciliation leaders, including Reverend Andrew Ashton, who's been to Syria on numerous occasions to investigate the situation there, but also to further the reconciliation process that's going on inside Syria, led by the Syrian state.
I mean, it seemed clear to me that article and others that appeared in the mainstream press were a reaction to unhappiness, shall we say, from the Foreign Office that they were there in the first place.
Absolutely, because we're seeing, particularly in the UK, the establishment of, or the attempt to establish a shadow state, both inside Syria and external to Syria. We're seeing Boris Johnson now promoting the HNC, which is a Riyadh-based opposition council, if you like, that's putting itself in opposition to Assad, external to Syria. So it's ignoring the very real and existing and prevalent Syrian opposition that is on the ground in Syria and working with the Syrian government towards resolution of the NATO war of aggression against Syria and the problems that has created inside Syria, but also for the future of Syria.
Well, they keep calling President Assad a mass murderer, so let's just have a look at this next one here, because the question in my mind is, what type of man is this? What are your impressions having met President Assad?
Well, I would throw this question back at all of these so-called peace activists and NATO left imperialist NATO narrative supporters, that if they genuinely want a peaceful resolution in Syria and an end to the bloodshed that doesn't involve mass carpet bombing of Syria and further casualties that would be instigated by the no-fly zone that they are constantly calling for, should they not be meeting with the majority elected president and his government officials, which, by the way, include members of the SSNP, for example, opposition parties, and the members of parliament? The parliament has been in existence for over 100 years, unlike Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for example, that are countries that these activists are quite happy for our government to deal with on a regular basis, that are true butchers and murderers. Assad himself, we met him for 2 hours. We fired questions at him on all subjects for those 2 hours. We haven't yet managed to find the time to write up that entire interview. It's 2 hours, it's a long time. We found him to be honest, to a huge extent very visionary about his country. And certainly a man of intelligence, as we know, educated in the UK. Certainly not the sort of demonic dictator that we've seen portrayed in the West and by the United States, and particularly by the UK and by the Telegraph article and by all of these NATO trumpeting activists. And we also need to remember that historically we've heard Gaddafi being described as a Hitler. We've heard Milosevic, who's now been completely exonerated, by the way, being described as Hitler. We've heard Saddam Hussein. And we've seen the results of this demonization. We've seen the destruction that's been wreaked upon Iraq and Libya and countries across the globe where this sort of propaganda has been allowed to propagate and perpetuate conflict and regime change.
So who else was with you on that trip? I understand other media personnel attempted to go on that as well, but weren't able to.
On which trip, sorry?
The trip that you've just come back from?
No, the only trip that media were not allowed into was into Aleppo.
Right, okay.
Yeah, sorry, no, bit of confusion.
So who else was on that trip with you?
With the U.S. Peace Council delegation, there was Henry Lowendoff, who's on the left in that picture, Madeleine Hoffman, Judith Bellow, Donna Nasser, Jerry Condon. Jerry Condon is Veterans for Peace, and he's recently written an excellent statement, actually, from Veterans for Peace, basically saying, look, stop the war in Syria, lift the sanctions, which are collectively punishing the Syrian people. They're having very little effect on the Syrian government, which ostensibly that's what they're for. But as usual, with any sort of embargoes or sanctions, those who suffer are the innocent people. So we're saying predominantly lift the sanctions, because the sanctions are affecting the health industry, the education sector, all the sectors that affect the civilians. These sanctions are inhumane and should be lifted, not supported. And at the same time, end intervention, end the arming of the terrorist entities inside Syria, withdraw all special forces that are boots on the ground illegally, whether they're from Germany, whether they're from the US, whether they're from the UK, get the hell out of Syria, and maybe start paying attention to the efforts the diplomatic efforts that President Putin is trying to instigate in order to reach a final resolution.
Okay, so obviously Andrew Ashdown and the people that went to Syria with him have come under attack in the mainstream media. You have also been receiving quite a bit of unpleasant vitriol and ad hominem as well. So it's interesting that the attacks aren't trying to knock down what you're saying so much as to attack you personally and attack your family background.
Absolutely.
Just what do you want to say about that?
Well, I mean, I think to some extent I see it as a victory on our part, because if these attacks are coming in as ad hominem attacks and they're not basically attacking, other than the usual accusations of campism, in other words, because we have met with the elected leader of a country that is under an illegal attack and aggression and intervention from NATO state members, backed by the Gulf states, Israel, and of course Turkey, then the only way that they're responding to this, instead of actually responding to the points that we're making, they're responding with ad hominem attacks, or accusing us of being funded, of course, by the Assad government. In other words, bought, paid, and becoming propagandists for the Assad government, which is ridiculous. They've been publicly attacking my father, which, again, to me, it's fine, continue, because actually, if they did their research and if they were perhaps showing a little bit more intelligence, they would know that my father, for his entire diplomatic career, supported the Palestinian cause. He was Middle East advisor to Ernest Bevin, who was a known anti-Zionist. My father was hated by the Zionists. I can produce quotes from people like David Horowitz, who loathed him because of what he represented. He represented the Palestinian cause hugely. He betrayed his own government.
Sorry, Vanessa, we'll just put a picture of your father up, actually. This is Sir Harold Beeley.
Yeah. He basically was involved in Egypt during both Suez crises. He was, as was Egypt, betrayed by his own government with the Franco-US British talks that were going on behind the scenes that he was not informed of, which, by the way, he actually leaked to Egypt, and for which the British government was not very happy with him. So, if these people are going to pick somebody for an ad hominem attack, it really should not be my father, and that's not because I'm his daughter. It's just really they're picking the wrong person, and I do wish they would go and do some decent research before they just start flinging various ridiculous accusations that are laughable, because the majority of them are Palestinian cause activists, by the way. So had they actually known their history, I'm a little bit disappointed that they didn't. They would have known the important role that my father played in the Palestinian cause.
Okay, well, somebody else that you met then was the Grand Mufti of Syria. Tell us about this man.
Again, a truly wonderful man of peace. And again, the same activists are disseminating this ridiculous video, which they're trying to claim he issues a fatwa against Europe and threatens to send suicide bombers into Europe. We've actually spoken to the Mufti on various occasions, and I actually confronted him with this video. And I have a statement from him which will be being released in an article that's to come very soon, amongst many others. But the reality is that in fact this man on numerous occasions, and including in front of the United States Peace Council, made the very clear statement that as far as Syria is concerned, and as far as he is concerned, the fire that has been allowed to engulf Syria, they are trying to contain it within Syria. In other words, take all the suffering on the Syrian people in order that this fire does not spread into Europe. And so, you know, we're looking at a man of tremendous wisdom and peace, and the ugliness that is being projected by these NATO left activists, I'm sorry, but that comes from their own twisted, warped and perverted vision of this world. It certainly does not come from this man.
Yeah, okay. Right, so let's have a look at this image that you took in Damascus, and you just wanted to show this just because it was so poignant.
Yeah, it was. We were sitting in the car in the middle of Damascus, and it was an area where a lot of the refugees have come in from the surrounding suburbs that have been overrun by terrorists. And we have to remember that 90% of the internally displaced people have taken refuge in government-held areas, not in terrorist-held areas. And this woman, I'm not entirely sure if she was actually a refugee. She was surrounded by many of the refugees. She was sat against the wall, and it was just a wonderful moment of just poignant love between, probably, I think it's the grandmother and the child. And I just discreetly took a few photographs of it. But you know, for me, it somehow it captures Damascus, and it captures what's going on in Syria.
Okay, well, look, let's move on to Aleppo itself, and we have a map here showing the various districts of Aleppo. Just give us a rundown on who is where and what these colours represent.
Well, basically, if you look at the red areas, those are the Syrian Arab Army, so the government-held areas. And if you look at to the west, that's what we're always talking about, which is Western Aleppo, which contains 1.5 million Syrian civilians. The green areas to the right of that is Eastern Aleppo, which is held by an assortment of terrorist brigades, including Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Noor al-Zenki, which is the group that beheaded the Palestinian child. And in the, as I said, in the western area, we have about 1.5 million civilians, and that's probably increasing as civilians in the eastern areas are using the Syrian state-created humanitarian corridors to get into Western Aleppo away from the terrorist enclaves in the east. In the east, contrary to reports in the media, in the mainstream media, there's now 3 operating hospitals, which were existing hospitals, which have been completely overrun by terrorists. The top floors are used as sniping towers. The hospitals themselves are occupied by terrorists and treat predominantly terrorists. They don't treat the civilians. We've been told this by not only the Aleppo Medical Association, but by civilians in Western Aleppo and by the Real Syria Civil Defense. By the way, sorry, we entered Aleppo by the northern gate. You'll see there, which is Sheikh Maksud, which is the. So we had to circumnavigate the terrorist-held areas, come in via Ley Ramoun and through Sheikh Maksud, which is the Kurdish-held area to the north.
Okay, so that doesn't sound like the safest situation.
No, I think I sent you some images of the sniper alleys and the no, basically where you're passing as soon as you get onto Castello Road, you're passing through high-risk areas where you've got the sniper banks either side, where if you pass checkpoints, you're told to speed up or to keep a distance from the car in front in case you're shelled by the terrorist encampments along the road. So, no, it's a fairly high-risk procedure getting into Aleppo, but well worth.
Okay, well, look, let's have a look at some of the media coverage regarding Aleppo. And a couple of days ago, we mentioned this on the BBC and the timing of this article going up. Syrian forces drop chlorine on Aleppo. And this was, of course, headline news on the BBC website at exactly the same time that Syrian opposition group you mentioned a moment ago was meeting with Boris Johnson. Looking at the article itself, one of the things that was perhaps typical of this type of propaganda, of course, the first scenes of the report from Jeremy Bowen included images of the white helmets doing their amazing work, and the people that were allegedly affected by the chlorine themselves didn't seem to have any symptoms of the chlorine, of any chlorine at all. So what is this? Just sheer BBC propaganda timed to coincide with the meeting of Boris Johnson and this opposition group?
Absolutely, and also you've got to understand that it comes on the back of reports about President Putin arranging a tripartite meeting in Moscow around the 18th to the 22nd of September, which would include himself, President Assad, and Erdogan of Turkey, in which there has already been an agreement, if you like, a sort of a proposition of an agreement, which Assad, seemingly this so-called dictator, has accepted. So that's one thing. You know, in other words, Putin is moving forward towards a positive resolution of the conflict in Syria, but without NATO involvement. Secondly, the Syrian Arab Army has made serious advances into the southern areas, into Ramusi, which had been taken by terrorists. They've retaken some of the Syrian Arab Army academies and schools, and that's right on the border with the Ramusi area. And so they've made huge advances. So, of course, as you say, combined then with Boris Johnson meeting the Riyadh-created, the Saudi Arabian-created opposition, the BBC had to come in with its amplification of propaganda. And yes, you're quite right. One thing, chlorine gas attack creates huge irritation in the eyes. We don't see any of that in any of the shots or footage from the BBC, and that comes from various medical people, both inside and outside Aleppo. Secondly, and I've asked the BBC this, and I've not had an answer yet, why do they not mention the fact that it's the terrorists that took over the only chemical factory in Aleppo in 2012? And secondly, why does the BBC never mention, for instance, in August alone, the 143 plus civilians that have been murdered by the NATO terrorists in eastern Aleppo, including at least 3 chemical gas attacks that killed one crew member of the Syrian Civil Defense, the real Syrian Civil Defense, based in Aleppo on the 2nd of August.
Okay, well, let's move on to this next media organization. This is the Aleppo Media Center. Now, is this the organization where most of the news from Aleppo, or at least from the eastern side, comes?
Yep, it sure is.
Okay, and we'll have a look at their website. Looks very nice. But then when we look at who's supporting them, we have here a report that they're supported by the Syrian Media Incubator, which is based in Turkey. And, well, who supports the Syrian Media Incubator? Well, it's by Canal France International, which is the French Foreign Office, effectively. And let's just have a look at the evidence for that. So this is their website. And they quite clearly say there that they are an agency of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So what we seem to have, Vanessa, is a lot of the news coming out of Aleppo being directly financed and organized by the French Foreign Office.
Yeah, it does look like this. We did this research I mean, we knew that the co-founders of the Aleppo Media Center had started life like so many, like Rami Jarrow of Anna Press, who, by the way, also receives funding from the Syrian Media Incubator. And so I'm pretty sure we can thread back to Soros at some point, our favorite person in Syria. But we know, for instance, that the two co-founders of the Aleppo Media Center started life as opposition activists in inverted commas and are again embedded in the al-Nusra areas. We also know, by the way, that the Aleppo Media Center actually have their own page on the Times of Israel, which is a little bit of an indication as to where their sympathies lie and who benefits from their propaganda.
Okay, well, let's move on with a little bit more, because of course Omran was a key image presented in the mainstream press just about everywhere. And one of the things that fascinates me, Vanessa, and maybe you can comment on this, is how individual cases, whether they're, I mean, this one looked as if it was perhaps staged in order to get the maximum PR bang for your buck, as it were. But we seem to have so many stories that, although they are mentioned in the mainstream press, perhaps don't get the sort of real financial backing that some images get. So I'm just going to say here that there are a couple of images here that are probably going to be a little distressing for people, and perhaps just take that warning. But you wanted to highlight Mahmoud here. This poor child stood on an IED trying to escape terrorists, if I'm right, and has lost both his legs as a result.
He was. This is a child. We were told by Dr. Nabil Antaki, who's been a sort of a wonderful source of information from Western Aleppo, and he's basically dismantled many of the Western media lies. When the photos of Omran came out, which have been sort of very heavily discredited, as we know, by many media outlets in the sort of independent media, he sent us this photo of Mahmoud. And basically, this child was born without any arms. His family were fleeing, I think it was in northern Aleppo, and he trod basically on a terrorist-laid IED, a mine. And we can see the results. He's now being treated in Western Aleppo, and Dr. Antaki is dealing with his case. But, you know, this is not an isolated incident. Certainly in Western Aleppo, in August alone, 54 children were massacred and many more mutilated, maimed, injured by the terrorist hell cannon shells that were fired into Western Aleppo. When we were driving into Aleppo, we saw really littered all along the route from when we started to get Aleppo in view. All along the roadside were unexploded gas canisters with the fins on the end. We've got various photographs of them, but the countryside was littered with them. And even when we were allowed to visit Bani Zaid, for example, which is a Syrian Arab Army liberated area to the northwest of Aleppo, there was evidence of the remains of these hell cannon canisters. And we were also told that we couldn't stray off the main roads and, for instance, enter some of the buildings because of the danger, the very real danger of mines and IEDs that would have been left behind by the terrorists as a sort of booby trap for any liberators coming in. So we had to stick very clearly to designated areas, and because certain areas had not been cleared, we had to be very, very cautious of going off track, if you like.
Okay, and then finally, I want to highlight once again Abdullah Issa, because of course he was murdered by Nur al-Din al-Zenki, this terrorist organization considered to be friendly opposition, backed by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Turkey, Qatar, and and this video was probably the most harrowing thing to watch, because this child, absolutely in fear for his life, obviously, begging them to shoot him rather than to behead him. And what we see here is a still from that video clip with these guys, the friendly opposition apparently, absolutely taunting and torturing this child verbally and emotionally before they cut his head off. And look who's proud to have their logo on this video, Site Intelligence. And Site Intelligence, of course, linked to Mr. Le Mesurier, who is the person who set up the white helmets.
Yeah, and is continuing to train them. And so, it is. We've proven before, and we're not going to run through it again. That the information is out there for anybody that wants it, both at UK Column and at 21st Century Wire. But the connections back from the White Helmets to the Blackwater Mercenary Group, to Site Intelligence, to Richard A. Clarke, via James Le Mesurier, are very clear.
Yes. Okay. Now, look, you've received an email from somebody. Okay, we're sticking with sort of media coverage of what's been going on in Aleppo, and so you've received an email from somebody commenting on a Channel 4 news story. We're just going to show a few seconds, the first few seconds of this news article, just to give a bit of context for the email. So let's have a look at this first.
Another day, another airstrike on rebel-held eastern Aleppo. Syrian jets or Russian, we don't know. But this is the Sukhari district, the same area allegedly hit with chlorine gas yesterday. And once again, children are on the front line.
So we have Channel 4 News absolutely promoting the government line, as it were, the Foreign Office line, the type of thing you would see on the BBC, perhaps. And this email then came from a friend of yours, Dear Channel 4 News, and it says, "Hi there. I started following your channel a few years ago as a respected channel that is different from the mainstream media. Recently, however, you've changed to be even worse than them. I wonder what happened to the old Channel 4 News. You're lying big fat lies about what's happening in Syria, especially Aleppo. May I ask why? What is your agenda of twisting realities in the ground and make them upside down? My family and friends in Aleppo City had debunked each and every video and news you published so far. Nothing from your news is correct about Aleppo and no one is believing you. You're publishing lies upon lies. Do you think that you can get away with it? Do you think you can publish any nonsense thinking that the masses of people will believe anything you say? I was in Aleppo City when your channel was showing the endless barrel bombs and chemical bombs used by the Syrian army against civilians, and barrel bombs and chemical bombs there in quotes. How come I didn't notice anything but the shells and mortars of the Western-backed terrorists, the so-called rebels, upon the civilians' heads on a daily basis? You're polishing the terrorist images and call them freedom fighters and moderate opposition, while they're terrorists and mercenaries. Your reports about Aleppo are pathetic. You turned a blind eye to all the atrocities that the terrorists have done to Syrian civilians. Who is this from, Vanessa? You don't have to obviously name them specifically, but
it's very difficult. People need to be aware that, particularly in Aleppo, people are very, very frightened. The people, when we spoke to Dr. Antaki the night before we left Aleppo, he told us very clearly, people in Western Aleppo are very afraid. If the lines break and the Islamist or the Islamist terrorists, the NATO-backed terrorists, enter Aleppo, they think it will be another Mosul in Iraq, and they're fully expecting that they will be massacred. I mean, they were making contingency plans on how they could best leave Aleppo and avoid a massacre, a real genocide, actually, in Aleppo. And so we have to understand the fear that these people are living under on a daily basis, and that's why we can't release any names when we present this kind of information. But this came from somebody who has family inside Aleppo and who has been in Aleppo for extended time very recently. He's from Aleppo.
Okay, well, let's leave Aleppo now and move on to the White Helmets. Here we have the announcement a couple of weeks ago, I think, that Syria's renowned White Helmets have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think they're repeatable on air. I mean, come on, you know, the world is actually going a little bit, it's going into bedlam, it's going into insanity beyond anything that we could have imagined even a year ago, Mike. You know, where we have CNN normalizing suicide bombers, where we have the Nobel Peace Prize that has already been given to Obama, who's probably the most butchering tyrant that this world has ever known. And now we have Al Qaeda fundamentally nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, we have the leader of the White Helmets who's been deported from Syria for his extremist connections, and yet has a starring role in the upcoming movie which is accompanying their nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. I do also have to say that I've had conversations with Mother Agnes, who you've had on the show, and that between us, we're going to be writing an open letter to the Nobel Peace Prize Committee protesting this ridiculous farce of a nomination. You know, we'll get on to the Real Syria Civil Defense in a minute, but the information that was given to me by the Real Syria Civil Defense in Aleppo leaves no ambiguity as to the real identity of the White Helmets. And honestly, beyond that, I have nothing to say to this other than people that buy into this propaganda, it is responsible for the ongoing deaths and misery of the Syrian people, so stop buying into it.
Okay, well, let's see if we can get... Sorry, Theo, can you just mute Vanessa while she's not speaking, because we're getting a bit of feedback there. Let's look at the type of propaganda that is actually coming out now, because we've seen it being ramped up over the last year or so, but I think this probably sums up the heights and the money that must be being spent to promote the White Helmets. So let's have a look at this quickly.
Go marching in when the saints go marching in. Oh Lord, I want to be in that number.
So there we go. Netflix. High production values, lots of money being put into a documentary. That was a short excerpt from a trailer for a Netflix documentary on the White Helmets. And you sent over this still from the video, which is a little commentary on, because obviously the motto that's in the center there isn't actually from the Netflix documentary, but you know, this is the response to that from somebody. One for all and all for NATO. This is a spectacular step forward in the level of propaganda that we've seen around this group.
It's extraordinary. I mean, as you said, the funding that is being poured into this propaganda mill, and the protection of the White Helmet brand indicates to us how important it is, probably to NATO, not only in Syria, but as we've said before, as a blueprint for future global intervention. And I think we have a responsibility, both as independent media and as individuals, to derail this process in any way that we can. Because fundamentally, when we look at, and as you know, I've been doing an investigation parallel to the other investigations that I'm doing with the EU Secretary General to get to the bottom of exactly how much funding is coming from the EU for this organization. And we're just kind of, after I think about 4 months of digging and pushing and waiting and being put off time and time again, we're just getting to the point where we're actually getting some serious information through. And we talked about it just now, Mike, but we know that, for instance, the UK government, the Foreign Office, has supplied, I think, around £20 million in funding. US State Department via USAID has given them over $23 million. But the paperwork that I'm getting through now also indicates that a huge amount of funding is coming in from other EU countries. Holland has put in at least 4 million, Austria 900,000, Luxembourg 2.7 million, Switzerland 23 million, Ireland 5 million, Red Cross UK 7 million, Denmark 3 million, France 4.5 million, and I'm only halfway through the list. So, you know, and then, by the way, we had the Joe Cox Fund that raised over 1.5 million for this independent organization. You know, I would like all of these pro-white helmet activists and NATO supporters to tell me how they define independent. How do they define it? I want this definition from them.
This is a good question, but this applies to many aspects of what's going on in the world at the moment. Now, in a second, we're going to show a video clip that you, just a few seconds of it, actually, a video clip that you took while you were in Syria. This is a doctor. He is based in Aleppo. Is that correct?
He's from the Aleppo Medical Association. You can actually see the logo in the background behind him.
Okay. Now the audio quality on this isn't fantastic, but we've done our best with it. But these are his comments on the white helmets.
I am one of the European EFNS Committee and American Academy of Neurology. Okay. So, this is, I can say that we didn't hear about this organization, White Helmets, and all the work there it's happening by some local staff with some foreigner staff. They came from Egypt, from India, from Pakistan, from Gulf region, but usually Syrian people are there and they are not well trained. They only for 2 or 3 months training from other facilities. But white helmets, we didn't hear about it and we don't know about it. And even our family there or our relative there, they didn't hear about this committee. And even with our relation with WHO, with UN, with the Red Crescent, nobody speak about this one.
So basically what he's saying is they don't know who they are. They're not obvious on the streets, certainly not in the way that the videos imply that they are. He's saying that they're foreigners from Egypt and other places, Pakistan, I think he mentioned. And so, I mean, the local people don't seem to recognize the pictures that we're seeing on video clips.
Well, I mean, he makes it very clear because I actually asked him. I think I asked him 3 times in that video clip, in different ways, because I wanted him to keep confirming it. He's in Western Aleppo, and he's actually working with the psychological trauma unit that is treating civilians that escape from the eastern terrorist-held areas into the western areas, again via the Syrian state and Russian-created humanitarian corridors that are never mentioned by the BBC, by the way. Basically, he still has family in eastern Aleppo, and he had asked his family what they knew of the white helmets, and they said, well, we don't see them. Now, this comment may seem strange, but then actually when I spoke with the Aleppo Real Syria Civil Defense, and the Real Syria Civil Defense has been in existence since 1953, they told me very clearly, and we'll come on to them again in a minute, but they told me very clearly, the white helmets are not first responders. They are terrorists. They drive around with arms in the back of their car. They are not dressed in the white helmet uniform, except when they're creating their promotional videos. People may say, okay, this is ridiculous, but the further evidence that I will give you that was given to me by members of the Syrian civil defense that were based in eastern Aleppo and were driven out by the white helmets and their terrorist associates will show to what extent this evidence is credible.
Okay. Well, let's just look at the real Syrian civil defense then. Here's a photograph that you took. Now, of course, nobody that works for the real Syrian civil defense wants their images to appear on the internet because they are literally at risk of their lives.
This photograph was actually taken with wonderful crew members in Latakia, which is the sort of coastal region, but right next door to Idlib, to Homs, to Hama, areas that are terrorist enclaves, and they are hugely at risk. And so you'll see I've been able to take photographs of the equipment. This crew member very kindly sort of put on all his gear in 41 degrees heat in order for me to take the photo from behind. Going back to Aleppo, we met with the Aleppo Syria Civil Defense, the real Syria Civil Defense. This is the badge on the sleeve of one of the crew members in Aleppo. We met them inside their unit in Aleppo, and initially I definitely had the impression they were very wary, and not one media professional has been to see any of the Syria Civil Defense units since the start of the war against Syria. And when we walked in, they were definitely very wary until I explained the reason why I had come, which was to expose the white helmets as the UK and US building of a shadow state inside Syria, and also to reveal to people the real heroes, the real Syria Civil Defense that has been in existence in Syria since 1953, that nobody ever talks about. Who are the real heroes, the real properly trained urban search and rescue guys, firefighters, who are on a daily basis, particularly in Aleppo, digging human beings out from the rubble of the terrorist hell cannon attacks and gas attacks. And in fact, they told us while we were there that on the 2nd of August, one of their crew members had been overcome by chlorine gas that had been fired into the citadel. 25 people were affected, 5 civilians died, and 1 crew member. And one of the reasons they died, by the way, is unlike the white helmets that receive brand new equipment on a regular basis via the EU, NATO, the US, coming in through the terrorist rat runs via the Turkish border. These guys, they're working in chemical attacks with the paper oxygen masks. They have no proper gas masks because the sanctions and embargoes ensure that they're not receiving any equipment to replace the equipment that's used. This ambulance that you've just put up on the screen was actually, this is in the Syria Civil Defense headquarters in Damascus, which, by the way, is about 50 meters from Jaish al-Islam to the right, and straight in front, about 700 meters, you're in the Jobar area, which is another terrorist-held enclave. So they are constantly coming under attack. They're unarmed, by the way. It's not a military organization. They don't carry arms. And this ambulance was fired on. All of the equipment was stolen, and as they pointed out, they can't replace it. So that ambulance is now pretty much out of use because it doesn't have any of the equipment. It was all taken by the terrorists, among whom are the white helmets. And the Aleppo Syria Civil Defense basically told us there was one guy there who had actually escaped from eastern Aleppo when the white helmets came in. And he said very clearly that the white helmets tried to requisition them into their organization, and they refused. So what they then did was to either kill them, kidnap them. He managed to escape under cover of darkness. He got out during the night, but had to leave his family behind. They burned his house down to the ground. His children are now living, well, he wasn't able to even tell us, but again, for security reasons, because they are at risk. His name was put on all the checkpoints in eastern Aleppo, so were he to return, or were a member of his family to pass by those checkpoints, they would be executed by the white helmets and their terrorist associates.
So he doesn't know where his family is at the moment?
He knows where they are. I don't really want to go into too much detail because I don't want to put that out there for security reasons. But what they also made clear was that when the white helmets moved in around 2012, 2013, the equipment that had been the existing Syria Civil Defense equipment was stolen. They had, just looking back through my notes, 3 fire engines stolen and various numbers of cars and ambulances. So you know, these white helmets that we're iconizing in the West and we're promoting for the Nobel Peace Prize are nothing more than terrorists and murderers and thieves. And this isn't an isolated incident. When we went to the headquarters in Damascus of the real Syria Civil Defense, we were told that the majority of the units across all of the governorates came under attack from terrorists. For instance, in Raqqa, they attacked the Syria Civil Defense. They massacred pretty much all the crew members. We met one who had escaped and is now working in Latakia. So across in Idlib, in Homs, in Raqqa, in Deir ez-Zor, crew members have been massacred and their equipment stolen by these terrorists, these NATO terrorist organizations.
Okay, well, let's see if we can't put some meat on the bones of their reputation and their skill base, because, for example, here we have certification of somebody being trained through the Swiss and Troop Training Command. So tell us a little bit about this certificate.
Well, basically, this was the visit. The final visit that we had was to the headquarters, which was in Damascus. And again, it took us almost 3 weeks to get this appointment. One, partly because of the security risk, because it's so deeply embedded in a terrorist-held area, but partly also because, as they said, they've not been asked to be talked to. They haven't been requested for an interview by a single media outlet in 5 years. So they were a little bit sort of perplexed by why on earth I wanted to see them. Again, once I entered, once I explained why I was there, once I explained my investigations into the White Helmets, they opened up hugely. And what they actually informed me of, which is of huge importance, is that the Syria Civil Defense, which, as I say, was established in 1953, in 1972, it was one of the founder members of the ICDO, which is the civil defense organization that is part of the UN, comes under the UN umbrella.
So we have an image of that here. This is the ICDO website, and on there you can go and get a list of all the member states for this. It's an international organization, and the Constitution came into force, as you say, in 1972. They were one of the founding signatories to the ICDO Constitution. And this is a UN-affiliated organization.
Absolutely, and by the way, despite the sanctions and embargoes, the Syria Civil Defense is still paying their subscription to the ICDO, which is 20,000 Swiss francs per year. They've continued paying this, despite the fact that since 2011, as we know, the UN, NATO, and predominantly the US and the UK have fundamentally completely marginalized this honored and kind of highly respected, highly esteemed organization, the real Syria Civil Defense, in favor of the White Helmets that isn't even a member of the ICDO, by the way.
And so the ICDO provides a medal, the International Order of Civil Defense. There are 3 grades of this. This is an invitation from the ICDO to the real Syrian Civil Defense to nominate people to receive this award. These are the awards, so this is an internationally recognized organization, the real Syria Civil Defense. And I would say, Vanessa, that it is a very common thing for the authorities to name something with the same name as something that already exists, with a view to giving that new something some credibility. So the White Helmets being called the Syria Civil Defense is really an obscenity, is it not?
It's an obscenity. It's an insult to these guys who really are the unsung heroes. You know, they're not receiving millions. Like we're now actually, after the investigation, we're now finally realizing the sheer level of funding, millions and millions, that is going into this organization. These guys, when I told them of the level of funding, and this was before the figures that have come through today, they nearly fell off their chairs. They said, well, we only receive a salary. We receive a state salary. That's it. We don't receive, especially currently, they don't receive any funding at all, because, you know, there's the economy in Syria is suffering under the sanctions. They don't receive any equipment because it's impossible to get it in. So they're running, and as they said, our arms are our equipment, and our equipment is being destroyed. The shot that you put up of the damaged truck, now this was from the Syria Civil Defense in Damascus. This was in, I think, I need to look back through my notes, in 2014. They went to a rescue close to Homs. So there'd basically been a terrorist missile attack. There were civilians buried under rubble in a terrorist sort of surrounded area. So they knew that the risks they were running. And they drove into that terrorist-held area, and they were hit by a guided missile. And the 3 crew members that were in the front of that truck that was up on the screen were killed outright. And one of them had over 20 years experience. What the headquarters told me was that they deliberately target those that they know to have the greatest experience, because what they're trying to do is to undermine the real Syria civil defense and to destroy its capabilities. And you know, when you start actually unraveling this, as you say, it is an obscenity. It's an obscenity that these terrorists are being paid millions to carry out mass murder, to undermine a real and esteemed and like world sought after Syria civil defense that, by the way, had trained people globally in urban search and rescue, and also sat with me and went through some of the White Helmet videos and discredited them even from a search and rescue basis. I mean, the equipment, they said, look, the equipment that the White Helmets are using is ridiculous. You never use drills, and we've seen this, Mike, in a rescue situation. If you look at the footage of Omran, for example, they're not treating the child. They're taking photographs. It's a promotional exercise, as are all of their promotional videos. And in all honesty, I'm not even convinced that they're all filmed in Syria. You know, we know that they have a training ground in Turkey. We know that in eastern Aleppo, for example, the civilians there don't even see them performing search and rescue, from what we're being told, but from witness testimony inside eastern Aleppo. So where are they filming these promotional videos?
Okay, well, look, we're pretty much out of time, Vanessa, so let's just mention quickly what people can do about this, or what they can start to do about this. We've already mentioned the Nobel Peace Prize nomination, so you know, people can obviously react to that if they choose. But the other thing that we particularly wanted to highlight once again was this, the London Fire Brigade, because back in February, we mentioned this at the time, the London Fire Brigade held a press conference, photo call with Raid Salah, who you will tell us again in a second exactly who he is, but he is a terrorist. And they were somewhat embarrassed by this situation when I spoke to the media team, and absolutely determined to make sure that I understood that this photo call and this press release came about as a result of organisation by the British Foreign Office. Now, nonetheless, the Fire Service now has the opportunity, because, Vanessa, I understand they have an open invitation to visit the real Syrian civil defence.
Yeah, I'm just waiting to hear back from our interpreter and fixer inside Syria, who was going to speak to the headquarters for me. But when I was there, I floated this idea to them, and they were certainly, you know, very positive about it, that they wanted to extend an invitation as the legitimate and recognized real Syria civil defense inside Syria. They wanted to extend an invitation to the London Fire Brigade to basically send a delegation to Syria to meet with them and to understand what they are facing. So in other words, not working with the White Helmets, which is a pseudo first responder organization, but to actually deal with what is an internationally recognized Syria civil defense, recognized internationally and by the United Nations, and still paying its subscriptions to the United Nations.
Okay, so perhaps people might like to ask the fire service or offer at least write in support of this idea, and perhaps we can get that organized. Vanessa, it is 5 to 2, so we've got to end this. Thank you very much for joining us. If you've got any closing remarks on this, on Aleppo, on the White Helmets, I know that there are going to be a range of articles coming out now that you're back and settled. So what's next?
Well, what's next is just really catching up. I've got a huge number of articles to write, not only on the White Helmets and the situation in Aleppo, but also on the various members of parliament that we met with, including President Assad, but with also the members of the opposition, how they see the future of Syria. And it certainly has nothing to do with the people that Boris Johnson is meeting with. You know, we have to... We actually have to start considering the millions, if not billions, that Britain is paying into the creation of this Syrian shadow state and into its efforts for regime change in Syria that is not wanted or desired by the majority of the Syrian people, and asking why this money is being put into this destructive effort when Britain itself is starving, when the NHS is crumbling, when the education system in Britain is on its knees. We have to start asking where they're finding this money to create an entire shadow state in Syria when the British state is in such a disastrous mess.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa, for joining us today. We'll have you back on in the not too distant future, I'm sure. Thanks to everybody for watching today. We will be back at the same time, 1 o'clock tomorrow with David Scott. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.